She was sitting on the edge of a narrow bed that wasn't hers when her daughter told her she had 2 days to decide what she wanted to keep. Not 2 weeks, not 2 days to move, 2 days to decide. As if the question of what a woman keeps from 74 years of living could be answered before the weekend was over. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and something underneath it, old carpet, old air, the particular loneliness of a building that houses people who have stopped expecting visitors. Marvella June Ostrander set her hands flat on her knees the way she always did when she was working very hard not to say what she was thinking, and she looked at her daughter standing in the doorway of that room, and she said nothing at all. Tamsin didn't stay long. She never did anymore. She set a cardboard box on the floor beside the narrow bed, the kind of box that copy paper comes in, the kind you'd use to clean out a desk, and she said Marvella could fill it with whatever was most important to her, and that Dex would be by Thursday to pick up the house keys. Then she left. The door didn't slam. That was almost worse. It clicked shut with the quiet, indifferent sound of a thing being finished. The facility was called Pineville Pines Care and Residential Living. There were no pines visible from Marvella's window. There was a parking lot, a dumpster, and beyond that a chain-link fence with a dollar store on the other side. She had lived in the mountains all her life. She had watched fog come down off Black Mountain every morning for 50 years, had known the sound of Crider Branch Creek the way she knew her own breathing. She had raised 2 children in those hills and buried a husband there. Now, she had a window that faced a dumpster and a copy paper box on the floor and 2 days to decide what mattered. She didn't cry. Marvella June Ostrander had not cried since Cleon's funeral, and she didn't intend to start now over a parking lot. But something happened in that room on that afternoon that no one witnessed and no one would have understood from the outside. Something very quiet and very certain settled into her chest alongside all the grief and the bewilderment and the anger she was holding so carefully, so deliberately, so still. It was not hope exactly. It was older than hope. It was the knowledge not yet attached to anything real, not yet connected to any facts she possessed, that she had not always lived in a room that smelled like this, that she had a history. That history, she had learned in 74 years of mountain living, does not simply disappear because someone throws it in a box. She didn't know yet about the old post office in Loyal. She didn't know about the tin box inside the wall, or the papers folded inside it, or what those papers would mean for the rest of her life. She had no reason to believe that anything was coming, but something was. It had been waiting for 22 years. To understand what was done to Marvella Ostrander, you have to understand first what she came from and what it cost her to build the life that was taken. She was born in 1951 in a 4-room house on Clover Fork, the second of 5 children belonging to Rupert and Calla Crow. Rupert worked the mines the way most men in Harlan County did in those years, not because he loved it, not because he had chosen it with any sense of freedom, but because the mountains offered coal, and the coal offered wages, and the wages offered the particular kind of survival that passes for stability when you grow up poor in eastern Kentucky. He was a quiet man, Rupert Crow, with large hands and a habit of humming hymns under his breath while he worked in the garden on Sunday mornings. Marvella inherited his hands and his quietness and his stubborn, unhurried way of moving through the world as though she had already decided nothing was going to rush her. Calla Crow was a different kind of person entirely. She was sharp and funny and had strong opinions about everything from pie crust to politics, and she raised her children to be useful before they were anything else. You learn to cook before you learn to expect anyone to cook for you. You learned to fix what was broken before you learned to complain about it. You kept your word because your word was the one thing that belonged entirely to you, and no coal company, no landlord, no hard winter could take it away. These were not lessons Kala taught in any formal sense. They were simply the atmosphere of that 4-room house on Clover Fork. You breathed them in, and they became part of how you were made. Marvella did well in school, better than anyone expected, and better than the county's underfunded classrooms really had room for. She had a particular talent for remembering details, names, dates, the exact words someone had used 3 weeks ago that made her teachers both impressed and slightly unsettled. She graduated from Harlan High School in 1969 and spent 2 years at a secretarial college in Middlesboro before deciding that sitting behind a desk waiting for someone else to need something was not how she intended to spend her life. She wanted to move. She wanted to be outside. She wanted, though she would not have used this word at the time, to matter to the specific people in the specific places she passed through every day. She applied to the United States Postal Service in the spring of 1972 and was assigned to the Loyal Branch the following autumn, one of the first women to carry a rural route in Bell County. The route took her deep into the hollows, up roads that turned to mud in March and froze solid in January, past houses where she sometimes knew, before she delivered the mail, whether the letter inside was good news or bad news, simply by the return address and the weight of the envelope. She learned the rhythms of those families the way you learn a piece of music you have played long enough, not consciously, not with effort, but with the body. She knew who was expecting a check and who was dreading a bill. She knew whose son was overseas and whose daughter had just had a baby 3 states away. She stopped being a stranger to those hollows within her first year. She never became one again. It was on that route, in the late winter of 1974, that she met Cleon Ostrander. He was repairing a section of fence along the road's edge when she pulled her mail truck up to his family's box. And he looked up from his work with the particular squinting expression of a man who has been staring into cold, bright sky all morning. He was 26 years old, lean and wind-burned, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a way of standing that suggested he had thought about everything carefully before he decided where to put his feet. She handed him his family's mail, a hardware catalog and a phone bill, and he said thank you, and she said you're welcome, and she drove on. She thought about him for the rest of the route. He thought about her too, apparently, because the following Tuesday he was at the fence again. And the Tuesday after that, the fence, she would note many years later with dry affection, never seemed to get fully repaired. They were married in June of 1976 in the parking lot of Cleon's family's church because the sanctuary was being re-roofed, and the pastor said the Lord didn't mind where you stood as long as you meant it. Marvella wore a cream-colored dress her mother had helped her sew, with small buttons down the back that took 20 minutes to fasten. She carried a bundle of mountain laurel because it was what was blooming. Cleon cried during the vows, which surprised everyone who knew him and surprised no one who loved him, and Marvella did not cry, which surprised no one at all. They built their life carefully and without rush, the way both of them had been raised to do. Cleon worked first at a lumber yard in Harlan, and then, after getting his certification, as a building inspector for the county. Marvella kept her postal route, transferring eventually to the Crider Branch corridor after a reassignment, and they bought the white clapboard house on Crider Branch Road in 1981 with a down payment they had saved over 5 years in a coffee tin in the kitchen cabinet. The house needed work. It always needed work. They did most of it themselves, on weekends and summer evenings, Cleon doing the structural repairs, and Marvella doing everything that required patience and a steady hand, which turned out to be most of it. Their first child, a son named Warren, was born in 1979. He was a healthy, easy baby who grew into a steady, decent man and eventually settled in Lexington with a wife and 2 daughters he clearly adored. Marvella loved Warren with the uncomplicated, sunlit kind of love that asks very little because it receives very much. Their second child, Tamsin, came 4 years later in 1983, a difficult birth that left Marvella on bed rest for 6 weeks, and Tamsin, from her very first hours, with a quality that the family would spend the next 4 decades trying to name correctly. She was not cruel as a child. She was not unkind exactly. She was watchful. She calculated. She understood from a very young age which behaviors produced which results, and she applied that understanding with a consistency that was, in a young child, almost impressive. Marvella did not love Tamsin less than Warren. She loved her differently, and with more effort, which is its own kind of love, and sometimes a deeper one. There was grief in those years, too, the kind that visits every life if it goes on long enough. Marvella's father, Rupert, died of black lung disease in 1988, slowly and without complaint, which was consistent with everything he had ever been. Her mother, Kala, outlived him by 11 years, sharp and funny until nearly the end. And when she died in 1999, Marvella felt the particular orphan quality of losing the last parent, the sudden sense of being the front of the line, with nothing ahead of you but open country. She had a miscarriage between Warren and Tamsin that she never spoke about publicly, but never forgot privately. A small grief she carried the way you carry a stone in your pocket, always there, not always heavy, but always present. And then in 2014, Cleon was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He was 66 years old. He had just retired. They had been talking about driving the Blue Ridge Parkway that fall, something they had promised themselves for 30 years. He told her the diagnosis on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table, holding his coffee cup in both hands the way he had started doing, because one hand alone had begun to shake. And Marvella listened to everything the doctors had told him, and then she reached across the table and covered his hands with hers and said, "All right then, we'll handle it." She did not ask how or when or what comes next. She had been raised to fix what was broken before she complained about it. She had married a man who stood still and thought before he decided where to put his feet. They would handle it, and for 5 years, they did. Until the winter of 2019, when Cleon Ostrander died in the bedroom of the white clapboard house on Crider Branch Road, with Marvella's hand in his and the creek, audible through the cracked window, running cold and clear over the same stones it had always run over. She had asked the hospice nurse to open the window an inch. She wanted him to hear the water. She was 67 years old. She had been married for 43 years. She had a son in Lexington who called every Sunday and a daughter who called when she needed something, and a house that was entirely hers, and a life that was narrow now and quiet, but fully, unmistakably her own. That was when Tamsin came home. Tamsin arrived in March of 2020 with 2 suitcases, a storage unit's worth of furniture she'd left behind in her divorce, and a man named Dex Frell, whom Marvella had met exactly once before, briefly, at a gas station off the interstate when Tamsin had been passing through the previous autumn. Dex was 53 years old, wide through the shoulders, with the particular easy confidence of a man who had learned that if you acted certain enough about something, most people would simply believe you. He sold insurance. He had sold other things before that. He had an answer for every question and a reason for every answer, and he smiled with all his teeth in a way that Marvella instinctively distrusted from the first afternoon he sat at her kitchen table and told her she had a beautiful home. She had not invited them to stay. That was the first thing to understand. There had been a phone call in late February, Tamsin crying, the divorce finalized, the apartment lease up, nowhere to go, just a few weeks, mama, just until I get my feet under me. And Marvella had said yes, the way she always said yes to her children when they were hurting, which is to say without enough thought and with too much heart. She had imagined Tamsin alone. She had not fully processed that Tamsin and Dex Frell were a unit now, and that where Tamsin went, Dex came, and that Dex had already been thinking about this visit for considerably longer than Tamsin had. The first weeks were almost manageable. Dex fixed a section of porch railing that had been soft since the previous fall, and Tamsin cooked dinner twice and did the laundry without being asked, and Marvella told herself she had been wrong to feel the way she felt in her chest when she heard Dex's voice carrying through the walls of her own house. She tried. She always tried with Tamsin. But Dex had been watching. That was what Marvella would understand later, not in March, not in April, but later, when the whole shape of it had become visible. He had been watching the house. He had been watching the property. He had been asking quiet questions in town, at the hardware store, at the county clerk's window, the kind of casual questions that don't announce themselves as research. How long had the Ostranders owned that place on Crider Branch Road? Was the property in both names or just the one? What did land run per acre out that way these days? The power of attorney conversation happened in late April. It was a Sunday evening, and Tamsin brought it up at the kitchen table after supper in the gentle, rehearsed way of someone who has practiced the conversation several times in private. Marvella was 70 years old. She had had a small health scare the previous January, a cardiac episode that turned out to be stress and dehydration, but had required an overnight hospital stay. Tamsin referenced this carefully. She talked about what would happen if Marvella had another episode and couldn't communicate her wishes. She talked about medical decisions, about bill payments, about how it was just a precaution, just a formality, just a way of making sure someone who loved her could act quickly if something happened. Dex sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, which was, Marvella would later recognize, the most strategic thing he could have done. She signed the document on a Wednesday morning. A notary came to the house, a young woman Marvella didn't recognize, someone Dex had arranged. The document was longer than Marvella expected, and the language was dense, and when she asked about a particular paragraph near the bottom, Tamsin said it was just standard language. Mama. It's all standard. And Marvella believed her because Tamsin was her daughter and she was sitting at the kitchen table in her own house and the creek was running outside and she had no reason yet to know what kind of morning this was. It was not a limited medical power of attorney. It was a general, durable power of attorney. It gave Tamsin the legal authority to act on Marvella's behalf in financial matters, property transactions, and contractual agreements. Dex had known this. Tamsin had known this. Marvella had not. The first withdrawal happened 6 weeks later. Marvella noticed it on a paper statement, $400 from her checking account on a Tuesday, marked simply as an authorized transfer. When she asked Tamsin about it, Tamsin said there had been a property tax discrepancy she had handled on Marvella's behalf, that she had meant to mention it, that it was taken care of now. Marvella looked at her daughter for a long moment and then looked away. The creek ran outside. She said nothing. There were 3 more withdrawals over the following 2 months. Each one was between $300 and $600. Each one had a reason when Marvella asked a utility adjustment, an insurance premium, a fee for a document filing. The reasons were always just plausible enough. They were designed to be just plausible enough. Marvella began writing down the amounts in the back of a small notebook she kept in her cardigan pocket, the kind of notebook she had used for years to track mail route details, old habits. She wrote down each amount and each date and each explanation in her careful, unhurried handwriting, and she said nothing, and she watched. In September of 2020, Dex brought a man named Curtis Prawl to the house. He was introduced as a real estate consultant, which was a title that explained nothing and implied much. He walked through every room of the house on Crider Branch Road with the deliberate thoroughness of a man appraising something he intends to acquire, running his hand along the door frames and looking at the ceiling corners and asking questions about the roof and the well and the age of the HVAC system. Marvella stood in her own kitchen and watched a stranger assess her home for 20 minutes, and nobody asked her a single question about any of it. She was furniture. She was already being managed around. That evening, she called Warren in Lexington. She told him what she had seen, what she had signed, what had been withdrawn. Warren listened, and she could hear him getting very still on his end of the line, the way he got when something was serious. He said he was coming that weekend. He said they would talk to an attorney. He said not to sign anything else, Mama, not one more thing. But Tamsin found out about the call. Marvella never knew whether Dex had been listening, whether Tamsin had simply read it in her mother's face at breakfast the next morning. What she knew was that within 48 hours, the temperature in that house changed completely. Tamsin stopped being gentle. She became brisk, efficient, businesslike in a way that was more frightening than any argument would have been. She told Marvella that she had spoken to a financial advisor who had identified serious concerns about Marvella's ability to manage her own accounts at her age. She used the word cognitive. She used it carefully, and she used it deliberately, and she watched her mother's face when she said it. Marvella felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the October air coming under the door. She was not confused. She was not impaired. She had been running her own life for 70 years with more competence than most people she had ever known. And her daughter had just looked her in the eye and suggested in the smooth, effectless tone of someone reading from a prepared statement that her mind was going. Warren arrived that Saturday. He did not get past the front porch. Dex met him at the door, not Tamsin. Dex and informed him, with the insurance salesman's practiced pleasantness, that Marvella was resting and had asked not to be disturbed, and that as her legal representative, Tamsin had the authority to manage her mother's visitors during periods of recovery. Warren called Marvella's cell phone from the driveway. The call went to voicemail. He did not know that Tamsin had adjusted the phone settings the previous evening to send his number directly there. Warren left. He did not give up, he called. He wrote letters. He consulted an attorney in Lexington who told him that contesting a durable power of attorney required evidence of fraud or incapacity at the time of signing, and that the process was long and expensive and uncertain. He kept trying. But he was 3 hours away and working and raising 2 daughters, and Tamsin and Dex were inside the house and inside the accounts and inside the legal documents, and proximity, it turned out, was its own kind of power. The house was transferred in January of 2021. Marvella found out not from Tamsin, but from a neighbor, Loretta Birch, who had seen the deed filing at the county clerk's office and called Marvella in a state of alarmed confusion. The transfer had been executed under the power of attorney, signed by Tamsin as Marvella's legal representative, conveying the property on Crider Branch Road, the white clapboard house, the lot, the creek frontage, to a holding company called Frell Property Solutions, LLC, which had been registered in Dex's name 6 weeks earlier. The house that Marvella and Cleon had saved 5 years to buy, had repaired with their own hands, had raised their children in, had brought Cleon home to die in that house now belonged to a limited liability company that existed for the purpose of owning it. The bank account, when Marvella finally got a full statement, showed a balance of $412. The rest, all of it, the $18,000 and change that represented 30 years of careful saving, was gone. She was moved to Tamsin's rental house on a Tuesday in February. She was given a bedroom that had been used for storage, cleared out imperfectly, still smelling of old cardboard and motor oil. She was told that this was temporary. Everything at this point was described as temporary. Tamsin's voice during this period had a quality Marvella could only describe as administrative. She was being processed. She was a problem being managed, a situation being resolved. She lasted 4 months in Tamsin's rental house before Tamsin announced, on a warm June evening without preamble or apparent guilt, that she had found a very nice place in Pineville that would be much better suited to Marvella's needs. She showed her a brochure. Pineville Pines Care and Residential Living. There were photographs of women smiling at tables with puzzle pieces in front of them, and a recreation room with a television mounted high on the wall, and a garden that the brochure described as tranquil. Marvella looked at the brochure for a long time. She looked at her daughter. She thought about all the things she could say, and all the things she had already said, and all the ways they had made no difference at all. She packed what fit in the copy paper box. She did not pack the mountain laurels she had pressed between wax paper from her wedding bouquet. She did not pack Cleon's good flannel shirt that she had kept folded in the cedar chest. Those were gone already, with the cedar chest, with everything else. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room that smelled of industrial cleaner. She set her hands flat on her knees. She looked out the window at the parking lot and the dumpster and the chain link fence. She had nothing. She was nowhere. She was entirely, completely alone. But she kept the little notebook in her cardigan pocket. Every amount, every date, every lie written down in her careful, unhurried hand. She was still watching. The discovery did not begin with anything dramatic. It began with a phone call about a cardboard box. It was a Thursday morning in late October of 2021, 8 months after Marvella had been installed in her room at Pineville Pines, and she was sitting in the facility's common area with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm because she had forgotten to drink it, which was not a sign of cognitive decline as Tamsin had suggested to the intake coordinator, but simply a sign that Marvella had been thinking. She did a great deal of thinking in that common area. There was not much else available to her. The call came from a woman named Shelby Combs, who introduced herself as the volunteer coordinator for the Bell County Heritage Preservation Group, a small nonprofit that had been working for 2 years to restore and repurpose abandoned civic buildings in the county. Shelby had gotten Marvella's number from the Harlan County Postal Retirees Directory, which still listed Marvella's cell phone from before everything had changed. She explained that the group had recently been granted access to the old Loyal Post Office building on Cumberland Avenue, the 2-room brick building that had been shuttered since 2001, and that they were clearing it out in preparation for converting it into a community archive. In the process of sorting through decades of accumulated material, they had found a box with Marvella's name on it. Not a box exactly, Shelby clarified, a tin. A flat green tin taped shut with Marvella June Ostrander written on the top in black marker. Marvella set her lukewarm coffee down on the side table. She asked Shelby to repeat what she had said. Shelby repeated it. Marvella sat very still for a moment and then asked 2 questions. Where exactly had it been found? And had anyone opened it? Shelby said it had been found inside a wall-mounted metal storage cabinet in the back room. the kind with a combination lock that someone had left open, pushed to the very back behind old postal supply catalogs and a broken electric pencil sharpener. And no, she said, nobody had opened it. It had Marvella's name on it, and they had agreed they should find her first. Marvella said she would come on Saturday. She did not sleep well on Thursday night or Friday night. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the building's heating system move air through the vents, and she thought about the old Loyal branch. She had worked out of that building for 11 years, from 1972 until her reassignment in 1983. She knew every inch of it, the way the back room smelled of rubber bands and ink pads, and the particular dry warmth of a space where papers have been kept for a very long time, the way the floorboards in the front room creaked in a specific sequence as you walked from the door to the counter. The way winter light came through the single north-facing window and lay flat and pale across the sorting table. She had been young in that building. She had been new to everything in that building. She thought about her uncle Harbert Crow. He had been her mother's older brother, a bachelor who had farmed a piece of land up in Bell County his entire life, a quiet man even by Crow family standards who had visited at Christmas and sent birthday cards with $5 bills tucked inside them until she was well into her 30s, because he never quite updated his understanding of what things cost. He had died in the summer of 2003, a stroke. Sudden, no warning, the way those things sometimes went. Marvella had attended the funeral. She remembered standing at the graveside thinking that she had never known him as well as she should have, that there had always been time for that later, and now there wasn't. She had not thought about Harbert Crow's land in years. She had assumed vaguely that it had gone to the county for unpaid taxes or been absorbed into some neighboring property. She had never looked into it. There had always been something else requiring her attention. She lay in the dark and held these two thoughts side by side, the green tin with her name on it and her Uncle Harbert, who had died in 2003, and she did not yet connect them into a conclusion because she had lived long enough to know that hoping too specifically for something was its own kind of danger. She simply held them. She waited for Saturday. A volunteer named Gerald Mabe drove her from Pineville in his truck, a kindness arranged by Shelby Combs, and they arrived at the old Loyal branch at 10 in the morning on a Saturday in late October when the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the particular cold clarity that comes to the Kentucky mountains in autumn like a held breath. The building was smaller than Marvella remembered, the way places from your past are always smaller, the brick darker with decades of weather, the small parking area grown over at the edges with tall grass gone brown and brittle. But the shape of it was exactly right. The shape of it was exactly as she had carried it. Shelby Combs met them at the door, a small, energetic woman in her 40s, with paint on her jacket sleeve and a clipboard she seemed to have forgotten she was holding. She shook Marvella's hand with both of hers and said she was so glad they had found her and led her inside. The front room was full of folding tables and sorted stacks of material old ledgers, postal supply boxes, framed photographs of former staff that someone had taken down from the walls and lined up carefully along the baseboard. The floorboards creaked in the same sequence as they always had. Marvella stopped walking for just a moment when she heard it, her hand finding the doorframe beside her, not because she needed the support, but because the sound had moved through her in a way she hadn't expected. 50 years. The floors still knew her. Shelby led her through to the back room, which smelled exactly as Marvella had known it would, rubber and old paper and dry warmth and something under all of it, like the ghost of 10,000 sorted envelopes. The wall-mounted cabinet was open, its contents cleared except for one thing sitting on the sorting table beneath it. The tin was dark green, the paint worn at the corners and along one edge where it had rested against something metal for a long time. It was the size you might use to store index cards or a small collection of photographs. The black marker letters on the top were faded, but completely legible. Marvella June Ostrander. She stood at the table and looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Shelby and Gerald had gone quiet behind her in the way that people go quiet when they understand they are witnessing something private. The only sounds were the wind moving against the north-facing window and the distant call of a crow somewhere in the trees along the road. Her hands, when she finally reached for the tin, were not steady. They had been steady through Cleon's diagnosis and steady through his dying, and steady through everything Tamsin and Dex had done to her. But they were not steady now. They trembled as her fingers found the edge of the lid, as she felt the slight resistance of a seal that had not been broken in over 20 years, as she applied the slow, careful pressure of someone who understands that some things, once open, cannot be closed again. The lid came free with a soft, dry sound, like a small exhalation. Inside, there was a folded piece of paper on top, a single sheet, the kind of plain white paper that had lived in every government office printer in America in the early 2000s. Below it, she could see the edge of what looked like a larger document, cream-colored with age, folded into thirds. Below that, something else she couldn't yet tell what. She picked up the single sheet first. Her hands were still trembling. She moved to the window for the light, and the pale October sun came through the glass and lay flat and cold across the paper, and she read. It was a note from Raymond Tuttle. She had not thought about Raymond Tuttle in 15 years. He had been the postmaster of the Loyal Branch when she worked there, a deliberate, formal man who wore the same style of gray cardigan every day and kept his desk in a state of absolute order and treated the Postal Service with the kind of institutional reverence that most people reserved for the church. He had retired in 2004, the year after Harbert died. The note was dated August 14th, 2003. It read, Marvella, your uncle, Harbert Crow, came to this office on August 9th and left the enclosed documents in my keeping, asking me to ensure they reached you directly. He said he had been meaning to speak to you about this matter for some time and wanted to make it formal. He seemed to be in good health. He asked me to hold these until he had a chance to call you and arrange a meeting. I expect he will be in touch soon. I am keeping them secure until I hear from one of you. R. Tuttle. Harbert had died on August 22nd, 2003, 13 days after he had stood in this room and left these documents with Raymond Tuttle. He had never made the call. Raymond Tuttle had waited and then perhaps assumed Harbert had changed his mind, or assumed Marvella knew and would come when she was ready, or simply in the way of a careful, formal man suddenly retired and suddenly released from responsibility, had locked the cabinet and walked away and never thought about it again. 22 years. Marvella set the note down on the sorting table with great care, as though it were something that might break, though it was only paper. She stood very still. The crow called again outside. The heating system in the old building ticked quietly to itself. Then she picked up the larger document. It was a handwritten will. The paper was cream-colored and heavy, the kind sold at office supply stores for documents meant to look official, and it had been filled out in Harbert Crow's handwriting. She recognized it immediately. The same handwriting from 30 years of birthday cards, the tall, careful letters of a man who had learned penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse and never abandoned it. It was dated July 30th, 2003. 3 weeks before his death. It had been witnessed by 2 signatures she didn't recognize, neighbors perhaps, and it was spare and direct in the way Harbert himself had been spare and direct. He left his personal property to a cousin in Barberville. He left his truck to a neighbor named Dale. And he left his land 14.3 acres of timbered property in Bell County, Kentucky, with a deed recorded in his name alone at the Bell County Courthouse to his niece, Marvella June Ostrander of Crider Branch Road, Harlan County, because she was, he wrote in his careful schoolhouse hand, the one who always remembered to send a card on his birthday, and because he trusted her to love the land the way it deserved to be loved. Below the will was the original deed. It was old, the paper soft with age, the official stamps faded to near invisibility, but the language was clear, and the legal description was precise, and the name on it was Harbert Eldon Crow, and there was no lien, no mortgage, no encumbrance of any kind. The land had simply existed, quietly and patiently, in his name and then in legal limbo, for 22 years. It had never been sold, it had never been transferred, it had never been discovered by anyone who wished to take it. Tamsin had never known Harbert Crow existed. She had never searched beyond the house on Crider Branch Road, never looked at her mother's extended family, never thought to ask what an old bachelor uncle might have left behind. She had taken everything she could see. She had not thought to look for what was hidden. The third thing in the tin was a photograph. It was a small, square photograph from the early 1970s, slightly faded. The colors shifted toward yellow the way old photographs do. It showed a stretch of timbered land in autumn hardwoods in full color, a hillside of orange and gold and deep red rising behind a small clearing, and in the foreground a wooden fence post with a hand-painted sign that read Crowland. Standing beside the post was Harbert, younger than Marvella had ever really known him, squinting into the sun with his hand shading his eyes. Standing beside him, barely 18 years old, holding a mail bag she must have just set down, was Marvella. She did not remember the photograph being taken. She did not remember visiting that land at 18. And yet there she was, young and straight and squinting into the same sun as her uncle, standing on ground that he had always intended, in one way or another, to give her. She pressed the photograph against her chest, and she stood at the window of the old Loyal post office, and she wept. Not the careful, controlled grief of a woman who has been managing herself through catastrophe for 2 years. Not the dry, held in sorrow of the narrow bed and the parking lot view and the copy paper box. She wept the way a person weeps when something they had stopped believing in turns out to have been real the whole time, loudly, messily, with her whole body, in the pale October light, in a room that smelled of rubber bands and old paper and her own past. Shelby Combs put a hand on her shoulder and did not say a single word, which was exactly the right thing. Gerald Mabe handed her a paper towel from a roll on the sorting table, which was also exactly the right thing. They stood together in the back room of the old Loyal post office for a long time. The Crow had gone quiet. The wind had settled. The pale light held. Everything had just changed. And no one, not Tamsin, not Dex Frell, not Frell Property Solutions, LLC, knew it yet. Marvella did not tell anyone in her family what she had found. Not that Saturday, not that week. She had spent 2 years watching what happened when she spoke too soon, and she had learned her lesson with the patience of someone who has already lost everything once and cannot afford to lose again. She asked Shelby Combs to keep the tin and its contents in the Heritage Preservation Group's secure storage until she was ready to act on them, and Shelby, who had read enough of the situation from Marvella's face to understand that discretion was required, agreed without asking questions. Marvella took the photograph. She tucked it into the back of the little notebook in her cardigan pocket, behind all the dates and amounts and careful documentation of everything that had been done to her. the photograph in the notebook, evidence of what had been stolen, and evidence of what had been waiting. She carried them both. On the Monday following, she called Warren. She did not tell him everything on the phone. She told him she needed an attorney, not a general practitioner, not someone who handled wills and closings as a sideline to other work, but a property and estate attorney with specific experience in Bell County land records. She told him she had found something and that she needed help understanding what it meant before she did anything else. Warren, who had spent 2 years trying to fight his way through the legal thicket that Dex Frell had planted around his mother, heard something in her voice that he had not heard in a long time. A steadiness, a direction. He said he would make calls that afternoon. The attorney's name was Patricia Goins. She practiced in Middlesboro, had been handling property and probate matters in Bell and Harlan counties for 26 years, and had the particular combination of unhurried thoroughness and quiet tenacity that Marvella recognized as the professional equivalent of her own temperament. They met on a Wednesday afternoon in Patricia's office on Cumberland Avenue, 3 blocks from the old post office building, and Marvella laid everything on the desk: the tin, the will, the deed, Raymond Tuttle's note, and the little notebook with 2 years of documented financial transactions recorded in her careful handwriting. Patricia Goins read everything slowly and completely. She asked several precise questions. She made notes on a yellow legal pad in a handwriting that was, Marvella noticed, almost as careful as her own. Then she set her pen down and looked across the desk and said that the will appeared to be valid on its face, that the deed was clear of encumbrances, that the land had never been probated because no one had ever come forward to initiate the process, and that as the named beneficiary under a valid will, Marvella had a legitimate claim to those 14.3 acres that would require a formal probate filing to establish, but was. In her professional assessment, solid, she also looked at the notebook and said that what it documented was consistent with financial elder abuse under Kentucky statute, and that Marvella should consider whether she wished to pursue that matter as well. Marvella said she would consider it. She considered it for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said yes. The probate filing was initiated in Bell County Circuit Court in November of 2021. Because Harbert Crow had died in 2003 with no other claimants to the land and no competing will ever filed, and because the original deed was clear and the handwritten will properly witnessed, the process moved with the particular efficiency of a legal matter that has no real opposition. Patricia Goins was thorough and meticulous, filing every document in the correct sequence, obtaining the required appraisal, the 14.3 acres of timbered Bell County land, including mature hardwoods and a seasonal creek. Appraised at market value and navigating the procedural requirements of a delayed probate with the calm competence of someone who had done this many times before. Warren drove down from Lexington for the court dates and sat beside his mother in the courthouse hallway and held her hand, which he had not been able to do in nearly 2 years. The land was formally transferred to Marvella Juno Strander in the first week of February 2022. She found out through a phone call from Patricia Goins on a Tuesday morning. She was sitting in the common area with her coffee again, and when Patricia said the words, "It's done," Marvella, the land is yours. She looked out the window at the parking lot and the dumpster and the chain-link fence and the dollar store beyond it, and she felt something release in her chest that had been held tight for so long she had stopped noticing the tension of it. She gave herself 1 day to feel it. Then she started making practical decisions. The elder financial abuse complaint, filed with Kentucky Adult Protective Services and supported by Marvella's documented notebook records, the power of attorney paperwork, and the financial transaction history Patricia Goins had subpoenaed, was already under review. The investigation moved slowly, as such investigations do, but it moved. Tamsin found out about it on a Thursday in March when an investigator called her cell phone. Marvella knew this because Warren told her, and Warren knew because Tamsin had called him in a state of genuine panic, her voice stripped of the administrative calm it had worn for 2 years, suddenly sounding less like a person managing a situation and more like a person realizing the situation was managing them. Tamsin called Marvella the following Sunday. It was the first time she had called since placing her at Pineville Pines. Her voice moved through several registers during that call: indignation first, then a kind of bargaining, then something that might have been genuine distress if Marvella had been less clear-eyed about the distance between her daughter's feelings and her daughter's conscience. She said there had been misunderstandings. She said Dex had handled things she hadn't fully understood. She said she was sorry if Marvella felt that things had been done incorrectly. Marvella listened to all of it. When Tamsin finished, she said, "I know what was done, Tamsin. I wrote it all down." And then she said she needed to go, and she ended the call, and she sat quietly for a moment with the phone in her hand. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication exactly. She felt the specific, exhausted clarity of a woman who has been told her whole life to see the best in people and has finally, at 70 years old, accepted that seeing clearly is not the same as seeing harshly, and that both things can be true, that she had loved her daughter and that her daughter had done this to her, and that neither truth canceled the other out. The Adult Protective Services investigation ultimately resulted in a formal finding of financial exploitation, and a civil recovery action was filed against Tamsin and Dex Frell for the misappropriated funds. Frell Property Solutions, LLC, was found to have been established specifically to receive the fraudulently transferred property, which the Bell County Court subsequently voided on the grounds that the power of attorney had been used outside its legitimate scope and in breach of fiduciary duty. The white clapboard house on Crider Branch Road, after a period of legal proceedings that Warren attended every step of, was returned to Marvella's ownership in the autumn of 2022. Dex Frell, facing both the civil action and a separate inquiry into the power of attorney filing, quietly left Harlan County sometime in the spring of that year. No one Marvella knew saw him go. But before any of that was fully resolved, before the house came back, Marvella did something she had been thinking about since the morning in the old post office when she had stood at the north-facing window and wept. She went to the land. Gerald Mabe drove her again, because he had become, in the quiet way of small-town kindness, a person she could ask for things. They drove up into Bell County on a Saturday morning in early March, following Patricia Goins's legal description and a hand-drawn map one of the heritage preservation volunteers had made from the county property records, and they turned off the main road onto a gravel track that climbed steeply through second growth timber and emerged after half a mile into a clearing at the edge of the 14.3 acres that had been waiting for her. The air up there was cold and sharp and smelled of pine sap and thawed earth and something green beginning underneath the dead leaf cover that told her spring was already moving in the soil, even if it hadn't arrived yet in the air. The hardwood trees stood tall and bare against the gray sky, their upper branches making the delicate, intricate pattern of a thing that has grown patiently for a very long time. There was a seasonal creek running along the eastern edge of the property, barely audible, the sound of it so similar to Crider Branch that she stood still when she first heard it and closed her eyes. She walked the perimeter of the land slowly, her boots finding their way through the dead leaves and the soft mud at the creek edge, her hands touching the bark of the trees the way she had touched the doorframe in the old post office, not because she needed the support, but because she needed the confirmation that this was real and solid and present and hers. A red-tailed hawk moved overhead through the gray sky without a sound. A woodpecker somewhere in the timber announced itself in 3 sharp knocks and went quiet. In the far corner of the clearing, where the fence line met the tree line, she found the wooden post from the photograph. It was weathered almost to gray, leaning slightly with decades of frost heave, the hand-painted sign long gone, but the post itself still standing. She put her hand on it. Harbert had stood here. She had stood here, at 18, with her mailbag set down in the grass and the autumn light in her eyes, and she had not known then what this ground would mean. She had not known what anything would mean. She was 18 years old and just beginning. She was 71 now and still beginning, it turned out. She did not build on the land immediately. She was not yet ready to decide what it would become. She arranged for a local farmer to hay the clearing in the summer months in exchange for a modest fee that went into a new bank account in her name alone. In a bank in Middlesbrough that Tamsin had never had any connection to. She visited the land on the first Saturday of every month, with Gerald or alone when she could manage the drive. And she walked it and listened to it and let it teach her what it was. When the house on Crider Branch Road was finally returned to her in the autumn of 2022, she moved back in on a Tuesday in October, the same month she had stood in the old post office and opened the green tin. The house needed work. Dex and Tamsin had not been careful tenants, but the bones of it were sound. The creek was where it had always been, and the mountain behind it was exactly as she had left it. She opened the windows on the first morning to let the cold air move through the rooms and clear them out, and she stood in the kitchen where she had signed the document she should never have signed, and she made herself a cup of coffee, and she drank it while it was still hot. She put Cleon's photograph back on the mantelpiece. She ordered a new cedar chest and put it at the foot of the bed. She slept that first night with the window cracked an inch. She wanted to hear the creak. On a Saturday morning in the spring of 2023, Marvella June Ostrander sits at the kitchen table in the white clapboard house on Crider Branch Road and drinks her coffee while it is still hot. This is not a small thing. This is in fact everything. The window above the sink is open 2 inches and the air coming through it smells of creek water and new grass and the particular sweetness of apple, blossoms from the 2 trees at the property's edge that Cleon planted the spring Warren was born and that have bloomed every year since, without being asked. The mountain behind the house is the same mountain it has always been. The creek runs over the same stones. The floorboards creak in the same sequence when she walks from the bedroom to the kitchen, and every morning when she hears them, she thinks, yes, and walks on. She is 71 years old. She has a son in Lexington who calls every Sunday and 2 granddaughters who visited last summer and helped her paint the front porch railing the particular shade of white she had always wanted it. She has a property attorney named Patricia Goines who sends a Christmas card every year. She has a neighbor named Loretta Birch who brings over soup when it is cold and borrows eggs when it is not, which is how neighborliness is supposed to work. She has 14.3 acres of timbered Bell County land with a seasonal creek along the eastern edge and a weathered fence post in the far corner where a hawk nests every spring, and she visits it on the first Saturday of every month and walks it slowly and completely. She carries a new notebook in her cardigan pocket now, not for recording withdrawals and dates and the careful documentation of harm. This one she uses for other things, the name of the tree she looked up after finding it along the creek bank, a reminder to call the haying farmer about the summer schedule, a sentence she read somewhere and wanted to keep. Small, ordinary notes. The notes of a woman with a life to manage. The green tin sits on the mantelpiece beside Cleon's photograph. She kept it. People have asked her why she keeps it, why she would want the reminder, and she tells them that it is not a reminder of what was taken. It is a reminder that Harbert Crow drove to a small brick building in Loyal, Kentucky on a warm August day in 2003 and left something for her with a man he trusted because he had always intended for her to have it. He died before he could tell her, but he had done the thing. He had made it real and sealed it and written her name on it, and it had waded through 2 decades of silence and 1 year of loss and 8 months of a parking lot view and a dumpster, and it had found her. Some things she has come to understand are simply determined to reach you. She does not speak about Tamsin often, and when she does it is without the heat that the situation perhaps deserves. There is a legal process still working its way through the courts, and she trusts Patricia Goins to see it through to whatever end it reaches. What she feels about her daughter is something she cannot explain cleanly to anyone who asks, because it is not simple anger, and it is not forgiveness, and it is not grief exactly, though it contains all three. She loved that child. She loves her still, in the complicated, irrevocable way that parents love children who have done unforgivable things, not with warmth, not anymore, but with the bone-deep, permanent knowledge that she was once small and was once held, and that something went wrong somewhere in the long years between then and now that Marvella will carry as her own sorrow for the rest of her life. But she does not carry it at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings. On Saturday mornings, she drinks her coffee hot and listens to the creek and watches the apple trees come into bloom and lets the mountain be exactly what it is. She thinks sometimes about the woman who sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and set her hands flat on her knees and held very still. She thinks about what that woman knew, even then, without any evidence, and without any reason to believe it, that history does not disappear because someone throws it in a box. That a life built carefully and honestly over 70 years does not simply stop being real because someone with a power of attorney in a holding company says otherwise. That sometimes what belongs to you is simply waiting in the wall of an old building for the right Saturday morning to arrive. She was right about all of it. She just had to wait long enough to find out. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because every week we bring you stories that remind us that even in the darkest moments, something extraordinary may still be waiting.